Super. Okay, well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining us. I'm Becky. I'm the Chief Exec of the English Association, and I'm really pleased to be hosting this afternoon. A quick word about the EA and what we are and what we do. We are a learned society and a subject association, which was founded in 1906 to support, promote, and celebrate the discipline of English studies. We cover all stages of education, from primary and early years through to secondary and further education, and to higher education and beyond. And we cover all parts of the discipline across language, linguistics, literature, and creative writing. Events like this one are made possible by the fantastic contribution of our volunteer speakers. So thank you so much to Kathryn, Robert, and Nick for your time this afternoon. It really is very much appreciated. Our members also make it possible to keep these events free and open to all by paying their membership fees. So if you would like to contribute to the national conversation about English and help support the discipline, please do consider joining us. It costs just £55 to support our events and campaigning work for a whole year, and you get access to a range of member benefits, including online access to all our journals. Okay, it's now my pleasure to hand over to our chair for this afternoon, Kathryn. And while we're listening to our guest talk this afternoon, I will be showing you some lovely pictures from this afternoon's book. So I'll be in the background showing you some pictures. Thank you. Over to you, Kathryn.
Thank you, Becky. Good afternoon, everybody. Absolute pleasure to be here. An absolute honour, actually, to introduce our guests for this afternoon, Robert Lacey and Nick Tucker. I know that I certainly quoted Nick Tucker many times when I was writing my master's thesis, and I'm sure many of you will be familiar with his work and writing, as well as Robert's, of course. My history is as a primary school teacher, early years and primary school teacher. I'm now an English advisor for Cambridgeshire County Council, and I also am on the editorial board for the English 4 to 11 magazine. Okay, so quite a varied background there. Okay, so I'd like to tell you a little bit about our speakers. So Nicholas Tucker was formerly the Senior Lecturer in Cultural Studies at the University of Sussex. Before that, he was a teacher as well, and then an educational psychologist. He's the author of 9 books about children, childhood and reading, including The Child in the Book, very famous book in critical approaches to literature circles, definitely. He's also written other publications, including Family Fictions with Nicky Gamble and The Rough Guides to Children's Literature as well, amongst others. Okay, and moving on to Robert, who is a journalist, historian and best-selling biographer of many famous people such as Sir Walter Raleigh, Henry Ford and Grace Kelly. And fascinating to hear that you were the consultant for the Netflix TV series The Crown. I'm sure I'd have many questions about that sideline as well. But his project recently has been to compile this beautiful collection of nursery rhymes with pictures based on the original picture book by Claude Lovett-Fraser. And we'll be seeing some of those fantastic images as we talk across the afternoon. We're here today to think also about the place of nursery rhymes. Is there a place, and what is the place for nursery rhymes in the primary school curriculum? Many of you on the call will be very busy teachers, and the curriculum is full of texts all jostling for position in the school day. So we'll be thinking about that. But actually, I trace my history as a teacher and lover of all things literature back to nursery rhymes, shared in childhood by my family, my parents, my cousins, and I could then take that into my practice as a teacher, where I had a rhyme for everything, for lining up, for sitting on the carpet. Fantastic. So I would strongly be advocating for their continued value. Something to cherish, certainly. Okay, so if we would like to pass over to Nick, who's going to start first with a presentation on his thoughts around that question. Okay, welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Well, I'm a great fan of nursery rhymes and to some extent a victim because having a name like Tucker, the amount of people who once called me Little Tommy, you know, Tommy Tucker sang for his supper. I knew all about nursery rhymes pretty early on, but nursery rhymes are treasures. It's rather like digging up an Iron Age encampment. They're there, and they're there simply because children remembered them. In other words, they were an oral culture passed on from child, and then when the child becomes a parent, passed on to the next child, and so on. The reason they lasted was because they have everything that children want. They've got rhyme, they've got meter, and they're quite naughty every now and again. Now, children's literature has always had to battle between books and rhymes that children really enjoy and books that are out to improve them. And on the whole, they've always opted for the first one. And we have to sort of balance the two as you grow up with the children. But there was a time when nursery rhymes were an absolutely total part of our culture. And even political cartoonists would put in The Brave Old Duke of York or Humpty Dumpty, very, very popular with political cartoonists, because we all knew them. And they were on the radio, programs like Listen with Mother, and any children's party, there'd be oranges and lemons, here comes a chopper to chop off your head, and go to the school playground, there'd be ring of roses, skipping games, and all that sort of thing. And so they are part of our national glory. In fact, I'll be chauvinistic enough to say that they are the best in the world, that the French have rhymes, the Germans, the Dutch, but we have so many. And one reason was that they were collected at a time when an oral culture was beginning to die. And that was with the introduction of printing and books, as opposed to old granny in the corner remembering some old rhyme from her youth and bringing it out. And once they came into print, they had a real renaissance, because you then got some of the world's best illustrators: Kate Greenaway, Randolph Caldecott, Walter Crane, Arthur Rackham, wonderful pictures. So they were a literal feast. But at the same time, once the books came in, nursery rhymes got stuck. And that's why, for an urban child now, it might seem a bit odd reading about a landscape with wells and haystacks and sheep getting lost and all that sort of thing. But I don't think that matters. I mean, that's part of their attraction now, I'd have thought, that they are about this vanishing world when people, stole pigs and ran away and all that sort of thing. But the people who put them into books, they realized that even then they had to be a bit careful. And so one or two, I won't quote them now, but there were one or two pretty anti-Semitic rhymes that got very quickly dropped. And in Lewis, where I live, there was a very popular anti-Catholic nursery rhyme, which again I won't quote, but that turned up in the books. But then gradually they realized that they were onto a loser there, and so they just stuck with the really respectable rhymes. But then that was the problem for now. The rhymes that we once thought were respectable are becoming often quite contentious. So Robert and I would have been brought up quite happily with Taffy was a Welshman, Taffy was a thief. And, Welsh kids were often called Taffy, probably one spin-off of it. I don't think you'd find that in an anthology now, because it's cruel. It sort of demonizes, mocks a part of the British Isles. But then there became more concerns. Was there too much violence in nursery rhymes? And there's quite a lot of death in nursery rhymes. There's stealing, there's quite a lot of beating. And they were rough. and so one solution in the 1950s and 60s, when we became more self-conscious about such stuff, was for authors to write their own nursery rhymes, to bring them up to date. Mother Goose in Cable Street, all that sort of stuff. It never worked, because the reason that nursery rhymes worked was, as I said before, children chose them. And they chose the ones they liked the best, and the ones that they thought the funniest, and the ones that gained most from repetition, wherever you were, in play and playgrounds or whatever. But so what happened was Raymond Briggs, who lived near me, he brought out a really almost definitive book of nursery rhymes in, I think, 1969. And that was a time when a whole tranche of British illustrators were brought up. Harold Jones, John Birmingham, what very, very talented ones. But already, I think, slightly sort of sense of the censors were creeping in. And children's books have always had that problem. I mean, the 19th century people, some of them really hated fairy. Rousseau said fairy tales were really wicked things. So telling children lies, we should never tell them. And one or two rationalists have gone on with that. And in a curious way, they had a point if the only literature around for a child would have been fairy tales. I mean, that is sort of taking them away entirely from everyday reality. But nowadays, I think people, there are problems. I mean, for one thing, it's an all-white culture, though, as Robert will probably tell you, there are very good ways round that with illustration. The other thing is that the medium for spreading them, which was very much, first of all, in the nursery, putting a child to bed in the playground, and then very much sustained by BBC, Uncle Mac. There's hardly a day would go by when you wouldn't hear a nursery rhyme on BBC at some stage or other. Now that's gone. So the question really is, have we still got room for them? And can we take on the arguments that are sometimes quite strong now about they encourage bad behavior, or they set an bad example? Now, my answer to that is yes, we must, because if we only produce books and rhymes for children that are good, set a good example, and send everyone away bored to death, then we are not serving our children rightly. We've got these things from the past. They're quirky, they're naughty, they're disruptive, but they're such fun. I wouldn't have been without nursery rhymes at any stage of my life. So I hope that Robert's brilliant book will start a counter-revolution and will take up this nearly, not losing, but a culture that might be in danger of being lost, and bring it back to life, just as some of the early 20th century composers brought back almost defunct folk songs right back into the main culture, and we're still enjoying their music today. So read a nursery rhyme tonight. I bet you'll laugh, and I think that's why I'm right.
Could I ask Nick, what is your favourite nursery rhyme? Do you have a favourite?
Good question. Very good question. I haven't got one. The one or two I don't like particularly, like Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. There's slightly pious ones, but I don't know. They're just there are too many good ones, quite honestly. And and if you think of them, they all fit the mood. If a child's being noisy, there's one. If somebody's not being truthful, there's another, and so on. So you use them as the situation demands.
Absolutely. And I was interested in your point about nursery rhymes being disruptive, because I was thinking back, and certainly across my reading history, and books that children often opt for, aren't they, are those books that are either banned or have been put away in a corner, or their friends recommend because they might have something a little bit naughty in the middle, like you said. So yeah, absolutely, it must be something innate, I guess, in
and I'll just tell
human
you
nature.
quickly, in the 70s, there was an absurd campaign started by the Daily Mail, which was that the Inner London Education Authority was banning black sheep. And that became a story. The idea of people going around to school libraries, taking out nursery rhymes, it was all a massive lie. It never happened. But that's exactly on a quiet day when a journalist has got nothing else to do. Why not turn on nursery rhymes and bring some sort of totally bogus story into public notice, and then sit back and think of another story?
Okay, thank you. Okay, lots to think about there already. Robert, would you like to share the book and talk about your particular compilation of nursery rhymes?
I would, thank you very
That would
much.
be lovely.
But I'd like to start by picking up that word you've just used and Nick used, disruptive, because here we are talking about something that sort of assumes, is there still a place for nursery rhymes, as if that's the end of them, as if they are in the past. And then Nick and you use this word disruptive about them. Well, aren't Elon Musk and all these other people who dominate the online atmosphere proud to be disruptors? And I think Nick was so right to pick on the dangerous, naughty parts of the rhyme as what has always kept them alive, and in my belief, will still do. I mean, after the Second World War, there was this guilt that English culture had about, well, the world culture had about what had gone wrong. It was the equivalent of trying to put things right after World War I. And one of the things that somebody came up with, a Manchester businessman, in fact, well-meaning, was to reform nursery rhymes. And so instead of confronting children with 3 blind mice, he wrote a rhyme about 3 kind mice. 3 kind mice, 3 kind mice. See how they run, see how they run. They all run after the farmer's wife, who cut them some cheese with her carving knife. Or maybe there's another version that goes with a piece of cake. But what's happened to that rhyme? That has gone the way of, more than the way of history. It is the naughty ones that survive. I'd like to turn particularly to the technical side of what I believe the English Association espouses. You mentioned it earlier. Reading skills. We focus now, and I think we've dealt with for the time, on why nursery rhymes capture children's imagination. Perhaps just we could look briefly at the technical support they bring to children's love of language. The fact to start with, that even before children encounter nursery rhymes at school, they encounter them at home on their mummy's lap or grandpa's lap or grandma's lap. They're more than just books. They have emotional connotations. And I was talking to a teacher only this morning who was saying that this emotional bond and memory that nursery rhymes evoke for a lot of children, let's say lucky children, perhaps, actually, in her experience, fortified the joy of reading for them, so that reading was a joy throughout their childhood, and with any luck would be that throughout their life, because of the positive emotions that it brings up. The playing with words, the breaking down words into syllables, the joy of rhymes themselves. The Queen gave a curtsy, the dog gave a bow. I've forgotten what I've forgotten how it goes, but the fact that when children start to read these lines, they read that a bough breaks, B-O-U-G-H, but the dog gave a bow, B-O-W. They learn about snow, S-N-O-W, and that rhymes with O, O-H. So in all sorts of imperceptible ways, I would argue that one of the roles of nursery rhymes is to give children a joy of language from a very early age. I mean, I'm sure many of you know about this already, but earnest academics in the States have had mothers, pregnant mothers, read nursery rhymes to their children in the womb. When there are learned papers about this, and when the child emerges from the womb, then, and for the life of me, I can't explain how they test this, but the children who've had the nursery rhymes read to them in the womb pick up reading quicker than children who haven't. There's a statistic which I've often debated with Nick, because he thinks it's somewhat spurious, and he'll doubtless tell us why he thinks it is. But there have been academic studies, much touted in Australia, that any child who knows 8 nursery rhymes by heart by the age of 4 comes top of the class in reading by the age of 8. Now, of course, well, I'll forestall Nick, and the point Nick makes about that is that a child who has learnt 8 nursery rhymes by the age of 4 is clearly in a literate household, which is going to encourage reading and literacy in all sorts of other ways. And we talked about the fear of death and that sort of thing. It's interesting how many nursery rhymes deal with the fear of falling. When the bough breaks, the cradle will fall. That indeed also seems to me to show how rhymes address children's fears as well as their pleasures. I mean, the baby in the arms, in the cradle. Think of the games one plays with children when you pretend to drop the child, but actually save it. It's clearly an important part of the child's psychology, which again we see in nursery rhymes, or the counting rhymes, 5 little monkeys sitting on a wall or whatever. And then children learn subtraction through these rhymes. Bed, Fred, no, although, in all sorts of ways, rhymes, I would argue, fortify children's joy, not just their capacity for reading and their knowledge of English. And I fully endorse Nick's chauvinism about the superiority of English. Don't forget, of course, that our English language rhymes are shared, of course, in America, Australia, Canada. And I think that Mother Goose, for example, was in fact an American character and first came into the world of nursery rhymes because of an American anthology. All part of the joy of the English language. Think of this proposition we're getting is sort of like saying, well, is Cockney rhyming slang going to go out of fashion? I mean, Cockney rhyming slang is, as we know, in some way a modern culture, well, a relatively modern cultural invention. But one can't, but its appeal revolves around many of the same things that make nursery rhymes attractive. And so are TV commercials and jingles the way ahead? Back in the 50s, again, people said, oh, when commercial television came in, that's the end of old-fashioned rhymes and so on. Kids will be learning and reciting jingles. Well, maybe they do for a short time, but I think nursery rhymes have outlasted them. So I'll stop, I think, at that point. Well, I won't stop, but I'll pause now and happy to join in the conversation.
Hey, thank you. So we have already one message in the chat. very kindly from Roslyn, who has dropped the last 2 lines of the nursery rhyme into the chat. The dame said, "Your servant." The dog said, "Bow wow."
Oh,
That
thank
was
you.
the one.
Yes,
I can
thank
remember
you.
the bow wow, which of
Yes,
course proves your point about rhyming exactly, doesn't it? Because I
yeah.
remembered the rhyme, even though I couldn't remember the missing line.
Indeed.
Okay, and there's also, we've dropped the link into the chat if you would like to purchase a copy of the book. It is indeed glorious. It's absolutely glorious. And I would like a massive print of at least several of the pages for the walls of my room. They're so bright.
Just a quick carry on with the plug for the book. Is that is the book. No, just the story of the book is that it was this is a modern version, 2024, of an old version, an old book of rhymes by a designer called Claude Lovett Fraser. He was actually a rather successful stage designer at the time of the First World War. He, like a good patriotic young Englishman, or maybe he was Scottish as well, he was never quite sure what he was. He volunteered the moment the war started in 1914. He was gassed tragically at Ypres. He was invalided out, and he died very young in 1921. That's the story behind the book. But before he died, he fell in love, had a daughter, and produced for her this little book of rhymes, which is, because of the technology of the day, black and white. The small thing I discovered in the course of publishing my book, it wasn't until 1972 that it became possible for children's books, any books printed in the world, to have color back and front. It's quite in the last half century. And so we applied all of that. When I say we, the young artist who helped me update the drawings. But to echo Nick, they don't really need updating, as he says. They've survived all sorts of things thanks to the oral tradition.
Thank you. I'd like to invite people to put questions now into the chat. I have a few that I'd like to ask and burning to ask, but certainly, by all means, do put any questions that you have into the chat for Nick and Robert, and we will do our best to answer them, or your thoughts as well on that question. What is the place? Is there a place still? Are there are nursery rhymes something to continue to cherish? Do they have value in that terms of the oral tradition, in terms of our heritage, but also where is their place in terms of teaching as well of language? So I'll just keep an eye, we'll just keep an eye on the chat. But one thing I was interested in certainly was Nick made the comment, and you went on to reinforce it with the discussion of the book, is that nursery rhymes were often, they sort of gained currency and kept this tradition because the world's best illustrators picked up on the nursery rhymes and made the collections their own. And obviously Robert is now continuing that tradition. And I was thinking about the link with illustration, but also the link, a lot of the rhymes you were flashing up, I was thinking of the tune as well. And I'm wondering, certainly in the book, there are some rhymes that I feel I've never seen before. And I wonder if it is the ones with either a tune or the strongest rhythm that have continued to be passed on, obviously because of that oral tradition theme. So I wondered what other people thought about that as well. So that's a whole mishmash of ideas, but as there was links being sparked in my mind as you were making the points about the illustration, the rhyme, the rhythm, and I could sing the tune as well to many of them as well.
I'll jump in quickly with something about that, which I expect Nick would speak to too. One of the what qualifies something to be a nursery rhyme? Because my hero, Lovett, who, made this selection, he didn't just do these interesting drawings. He picked rhymes, and there were traditional ones like Hey Diddle Diddle and Humpty Dumpty. But then I turned the page, and here's a picture of a robin redbreast in a cage with the line, "A robin redbreast in a cage sets all heaven in a rage." Well, I don't think we need Nick to tell us that that's not a traditional nursery rhyme. In fact, as a doctor of English literature, he will tell us that that is a line from William Blake. And so Lovett took a robin redbreast in a cage, sets all heaven in a rage, and he turned it into a nursery rhyme. I've picked it up in my book. We got another one. The poor man's farthing is worth more than all the gold on Afric's shore. Again, William Blake. And of course, Lovett picked up William Blake long before he became fashionable, as he is today. Well, can I ask a question to my fellow panelist? What qualifies something to be a nursery rhyme, Nick?
Well, we've had this before, Robert. It's whether it's in a book of nursery rhymes. Because the Opis, Mr. and Mrs. Opie, the great experts in nursery rhymes, were very much against the idea that there was an absolute irreversible canon of nursery rhymes. And they said that they change. You go to Scotland or Wales, you might get the same basic rhyme, but with different words. There's no definitive nursery rhyme because no one ever wrote them. They just emerged and had regional variations all over the place. And so, you've now turned 2 bits of Blake into nursery rhymes, and good luck, Robert. Why not? That's what we should be doing, perhaps dropping a few of them, but adding a few new ones. But going back to music, that's so important, I agree, because nursery rhymes were often sung. And the reason you sing to babies isn't simply because you love them, but because babies respond to being sung to. And that's why we have lullabies. And anybody trying to nurse a baby at 2 or 3 in the morning, in the days before we had sort of ways of keeping them somnolent, would be rocking them and singing, because babies like being sung to. And so the tunes that people would choose to accompany these rhymes were sort of very much 18th century tunes, sort of left over from folk songs or bits of this or bits of that or something. And of course, if you add music to rhyme and meter, that's 3 things that will help lodge the rhyme in any child's brain for the rest of their lives.
And I'd like to take up something that you haven't said today, but I remember you saying to me in an earlier discussion. You mentioned earlier how nursery rhymes suddenly came to life in the early 19th century. And well, they'd been printed before that, but suddenly they were reprinted and became very successful. And I always remember you saying to me, well, what happened in the early 19th century? The Industrial Revolution. And what was one of the challenges of the Industrial Revolution? You had to get to bed at night and get up in the morning to go to the factory. And one of the things you had to do was get the bloody kids to sleep before you went off to work. And so that's actually when nursery rhymes enjoyed an enormous printed boom, because they had, as for many of us, they still continue to have, a very useful function in that respect, in helping children get to sleep at night.
Yes, and all those falling rhymes, Robert, you talked about, I mean, they do play with a child's fear, but they're also enormous fun. So you've got a sort of screaming baby and you do rockabye baby and drop it. The child will sort of might stop crying and think this is quite an interesting game and want to play it again. So sorry, who's on now?
I can't, I've lost the sound of Kathy.
Here we go.
Yeah,
So here I am. I've just, there's a question in the chat. Just having a little look down here. I'm a very experienced music educator, Cyrilla. which uses rhymes and songs from children's culture as material through which to learn musical elements such as pulse and rhythm. A lot of the traditional nursery rhymes have tunes which are really hard for young children to sing, but they're wonderful for parents and carers to sing to the children, which again, actually, thank you for that comment, but I think that picks up on what you've just been saying, hasn't it? Where nursery rhymes began to gain that currency because they were used as a tool in a sort of harassed parents toolkit. As well as the sort of intrinsic value of the rhymes themselves as rhymes. Okay, thank you for that comment. I'm interested, along with the rhyme and rhythm, and thinking also about the illustration aspect. I wonder who you might see as producing the sort of next generation of nursery rhymes, if there is such a thing. Do you see particular poets at the moment stepping into that mantle, or particular author illustrators stepping sort of into that world?
I've got a sort of answer for you. It's not exactly the answer that because you're asking for the unanswerable in a way. But one of the successes of Dr. Seuss, or Seuss, I'm never quite sure how to pronounce it, is the fact that he made use of rhyme so much. One of the most successful books, children's books ever, is The Cat in the Hat. And the rhythm or the onomatopoeia there, or whatever it is, in the title, as in his other titles, I think is an enormous part of his success. And talking of another American rhymester and illustrator, I've got here a book of Maurice Sendak. Okay. And perhaps people forget how when Maurice Sendak's drawing, I mean, here's a book called Seven Little Monsters, and we don't think twice about that now, but I can remember when Maurice Sendak books first came out, they were considered shocking because they actually played with ugliness and fear, and actually very cleverly and very well actually built on and developed the tradition of nursery rhyme. So I suppose my answer to your question is the modern Maurice Sendak, and I can't put a name to him or her, will presumably provide the way ahead. He was clever enough to pick out naughtiness and fear and monsters and ugliness and dread, and turn them into his books. And well, there are many illustrators around today who follow in those footsteps, and I think that's the best answer I could give to your question.
Yeah, and on a commercial basis, we should remember that nursery rhymes are out of copyright for about 500 years. Okay. If any brilliant young artists did bring out their own anthology, they wouldn't have to pay off in the way that you would if you're bringing out a book of poems written within the last 75 years or something.
Good point. We've had a flurry of comments into the chat, actually, so I'm just now going to try and pick them up because I'm aware of the time as well. So hang on, here we go. So yes, someone has mentioned Julia Donaldson in terms of putting actions to accompany some of her texts, such as the Gruffalo. And I think actually she started, didn't she, as a songwriter, maybe, I think, and then moved to books. Is that right?
Yeah, they were originally. And then when she was signing her books, her husband would entertain the cues of children playing on his guitar. But he told me he was dismayed by how many of the children queuing up didn't actually recognize the nursery rhymes. That's what made me get a little bit worried that all this heritage I'd so utterly taken for granted might actually be at risk.
So thank you. I'm just juggling the chat at the moment. There's another message here, Rosalind again, saying, I teach English as a second language to adults around the world. And the one thing I find is that most international adult learners of English have no idea about English nursery rhymes. And she's saying she felt that she did learn them as a child. Yeah, something to do there with the pronunciation. And maybe it's to do with the structure of the English language there. And she's pointed out that the fact that, you know, the archaic vocabulary in there. And again, some of our rhyme structures within our English language aren't particularly kind, are they, to you know, alternative pronunciations of different spellings as well. So that's what she's thinking about there. And then another person has commented about overprotection of finding the overprotection of children concerning. There is a strong school of thought that they should not encounter anything about death, danger, fighting, etc. So nursery rhymes are often frowned upon. I guess sometimes folks are just a bit worried, aren't they? Particularly if they're teaching about whether something is appropriate or not. And Patrick has said also regarding where new nursery rhymes come from and whether old ones last or are still relevant. Modern folklorists find children still recite, share and pass on nursery rhymes, playground rhymes and singing rhymes. Some recent projects pre and post COVID went back to schools the OPs visited in the 1950s and 1960s to collect playground rhymes. How lovely. I didn't know that. And Dr. Julia Bishop of Sheffield has done a lot of work in this area and brought together the work of many folklorists in this field now working with children. Okay, so we've got a new generation of OPs, it would seem, going around collecting the rhymes, which sounds lovely, doesn't it? And again, another comment here from Joe. Saying in primary, lots of children recognise nursery rhymes from illustrations, but few can recite any. Okay. And again, someone saying that a friend had made a collection of playground songs and rhymes from London primary schools in the 1980s. So quite a few comments there. It was quite a scattering of opinions, really, in terms of what's going on, really. Certainly the work I do in schools, children are likely often to come in knowing some illustrated stories, such as the Gruffalo, as much as nursery rhymes. So I think the two things hopefully will run alongside each other. And certainly in the national curriculum and some documents that have come out to advise teachers recently, there has been stressing the place of rhymes. So it's had that sort of backing, if you like, from you know, the Department of Education. So hopefully we will continue to see them. So thank you very much. I'm aware of the time. It is 5:30, so we're due to close. I think my brain is going to be fizzing all evening as I make connections between the things that you've said. I just wanted to say about the book as well, because in the back of the book, there's an absolutely fascinating section on the history of the nursery rhymes as well, which we haven't even touched on today, and the stories behind each individual rhyme, which I found fascinating as an adult reader. So I suppose there's a question there about how much we share those kind of backstories with children as well. But otherwise, yes, I think there's a lot of evidence there in the chat, and from what you're both presenting today, thank you very much, that yes, there is that place, hopefully, and we will continue waving the flag or whatever the the statement is for the place of nursery rhymes in the curriculum. So thank you very much, Becky, would you like to say something to close?
Thank you. Yes. Thank you so much, Kathryn, for chairing. And thank you so much to Robert and to Nick for your time. I know we could keep going. It's fascinating. We will shortly be announcing another one of these events to take place in June, which will be about the role of nursery rhymes in multilingual classrooms and learning other languages in early years and primary. So keep an eye out for that. And I hope to see you all at another of our events soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye. Pleasure.